And how is she?
She's well. She's well. She's still with Democracy Now!
Yeah, so every so often I get an email from her about, who can you suggest me?
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
See her better.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. We are about to begin our session titled International and Regional Politics Impacting South Asia. Please switch off your mobile phones or put them on silence mode. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the discussion. We would appreciate if complete silence is observed while the session is in progress. And can we close the door? Thank you for coming, and please come inside and close the door. Our moderator for this session is Dr. Huma Bakai, who is Associate Professor, Director Public Affairs and Communication, and former Chairperson, Department of Social Sciences, IBA Karachi. She has remained associated with the media for the past several years, both as an analyst and anchor person. She has anchored current affairs shows on News One and PTV. Presently, she is associated with Channel 24 and Radio Pakistan. She has also taught at the Department of International Relations, University of Karachi. Over to you, Dr. Huma.
Thank you. Thank you for that very kind, long introduction. And I thank all of you for coming here, for being here. And I thank my audience for standing. So I love the interest that names like these have generated. The session is on international and regional politics impacting South Asia. And I think internationally we would like to know what is Trump going to do to this world. And regionally, we'd like to look at the great triangle that is there. And what is this great triangle? I call it the triangular relationship between Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India. And then, of course, we have global powers who are pulling the strings, so that perhaps includes China, and we cannot talk about regional politics without CPEC, and how is globalization impacting all this, and is US really becoming an inward-looking state, or we will see Trump moving to the center, which he already has if we look at policies on One China, and perhaps also the travel ban, and what is happening next door, important elections coming up, what is happening in Pakistan, and how will all of that impact the region, and of course, how is the global politics going to impact us? You all know we have a very eminent panel. So we have a historian, Mr. Kirk. We have a former ambassador who's also served in the United States, Mr. Najmuddin Sheikh, continues to be very relevant to what is happening, writes very regularly for important international and national magazines. Then we have Zia, who looks at issues of global security. While I was talking to him before the show, he said, I'm a physicist, but here he is. And of course, last but not least, nothing gets completed without economy. It's the economy is stupid. So we have economist Asad Said, who's going to talk about how the economic paradigm would impact regional and global politics. What we're going to do here is that we'll allow each of the speakers to give their input for, say, 5 minutes, and then another 2 minutes for them to comment on each other's initial build-up of the discussion, and then we'll open the discussion. It is over to you. So we're going to have a very interactive session, but for the first 5 to 15 minutes that we're going to spend where the speakers are going to say their point of view, I'd like you to be attentive and take points. And towards the end, when you do the Q&A session, we have the Q&A session, I'd have a small request. Confine it to comments, keep it short so that we have maximum people participating in it. Once again, thank you for being here. And Najmuddin Sheikh Saab.
Thank you, Dr. Bakai. It's very kind of you to call on me first, but I thought maybe we need to adjust the title of this a bit. We're talking about, when we talk about impacting South Asia, we really mean impacting Pakistan, because when we talk about the regional, we're talking really about South Asia. So let me start with my perception of the international situation and how it impacts Pakistan, South Asia and Pakistan. And of course, the elephant in the room, I'm not sure that he probably doesn't like that phrase very much, but the elephant in the room is going to be President Trump and the policies that he intends following. Obviously, there are other factors that need to be built in. Well, what is happening between Russia and America, what is happening between Russia and Europe, or what is happening between China and Russia, what is happening in terms of China's relationships with this area. But the predominant element at this time in terms of changes, and I'm not going to talk about Brexit, I'm not going to talk about the EU relationships and the EU's possible splits, etc., but focus on what is fundamental to South Asia and to Pakistan in particular. Now, as I see it, President Trump has talked about focusing internally and not wasting money or efforts abroad, except in terms of how much it gains for the United States of America. But I think South Asia is going to be an exception to this rule. He's got Secretary of Defense General Mattis. He's got Lieutenant General Flynn as his National Security Advisor. Both of them have long experience of this region, and both of them have a particular point of view with regard to Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan for the United States has become an enormous burden. They've been there since 2001, and from 2001, it's been 16 years. General Nicholson, the commander of the ISAF forces in Afghanistan, has talked about the fact that we will need at least another 4 years. And he has made it clear that when he says some things of this nature, he's doing this with clearance from his higher authorities in the army. So when he says that 8,400 people are not going to be enough, and when he's asked what sort of figure he would have in mind, he says, I can do with less than 50,000. And when he's asked if he can do with less than 30,000, he sort of quibbles and seems to suggest that that's the sort of figure he would like. Now, this
so
means...
just to interrupt you, from Obama saying that he will not take back 5,500 troops from Afghanistan, we're looking at 30,000 troops in Afghanistan?
No, not quite. I'm saying that this is what
he's asking for.
Yeah, if beggars could ride, that sort of situation. I don't think that he'll get that. But what he will get is a support for an increase in forces, because he thinks that he has enough to do his counter-terrorism, but he does not have enough to train the Afghan forces. And therefore, he needs more people to be able to take on the training task. And until that training task is taken on, he doesn't believe that their counter-terrorism...
Najmuddin Sheikh Sahab, a quick word on how will this impact the Taliban situation? Because they want the troops out.
Yeah.
And how will it impact Pakistan? Is it good for Pakistan, then things would be under control in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think, let me be clear. One, there are elements in the Taliban, it seems, where there has been a degree of a split. There has been a degree of split. Now, Habibatullah, the nominal leader, no longer commands the loyalty of all factions. There is a faction which is known as the Mansour faction in Helmand, which is probably the most powerful, and which is refusing to provide the funding. The principal source of funding happens to be Helmand province and the narcotics trade, and that funding is not getting to Habibatullah. So there are splits, and there is a possibility, not a very clear possibility, but nevertheless a possibility, that some units of the Taliban may be prepared to talk. And there will be others who will be strongly opposed, because for them, instability is a good thing. There are other elements in Afghanistan to whom the same thing applies, because today there's a warlord, I'll call him a warlord, he thinks of himself as the governor of Balkh, Atta Mohammad Noor, who wants to negotiate a separate agreement with President Ghani, and in the process sideline Abdullah Abdullah. Now, Abdullah obviously has no political base of his own. He depends on people like Atta Mohammad Noor to provide him the political backing. If this is going to break down, then that national unity government is going to break down.
All right, I want you to hold your thought, and Matthew, I want you to come on this, and I'm going to ask you a very specific question. And in fact, two specific questions. One, talks with the Taliban. Is it still the United States which is pulling the strings? Are there new actors? Is China in Moscow? Beijing in Moscow will do what perhaps US was not able to pull off? And what will this increase in troops happen? Do you see it happening?
I would probably refer those questions to individuals who know more about international affairs. As a historian and who has committed most of his career to studying things locally, I've actually run away from international and regional affairs. So I am a bit of the weak link up here today. But nonetheless, what I'd like to do, given the fact that you've given us 5 minutes to sort of riff off this general theme, is to link it up, I think, to something that is important that might not be geostrategic in nature. Because very often when we talk about U.S. relations with Pakistan, it is always in a geostrategic sort of set of frame of reference. And today I'd like to sort of just talk about this particular theme as it relates to the question of why there aren't more visible U.S. scholars doing work in Pakistan. I think this is really an important thing. And because international and regional politics plays directly into answering or potential answers for this particular question of why you don't have U.S. scholars being more visible in Pakistan, particularly in the last 15 years or so. In some cases, in one way, I guess in the larger sort of international politics perspective, an answer for this has to go back all the way, of course, to the nuclear bomb, both in India as well as here, and the subsequent restrictions that were put on U.S. relations and particularly funding for U.S. scholars to come to Pakistan. As a result, I mean, there is effectively, I mean, we're going to talk about maybe a ban that's more recent, but there has in fact been essentially a ban on U.S. scholars that comes from the U.S. side as a result of lack of funding for at least the last 15 years. And the initial sort of impetus for this had to do with the nuclear tests, a sort of hangover, if you will, from that particular time period. But I also might have to say that this also changed. I mean, it got worse after 9/11, but this whole situation did change under the Obama administration, under Hillary Clinton, who decided that, you know, people-to-people interactions that were non-geostrategic, non-political in nature would be a very productive way to sort of increase good relations between Pakistan and the United States.
I hate to stop you, but you know how we are here in Pakistan. So when you say that very few American scholars are working on Pakistan, what is the situation on India?
Let me rephrase
how
that.
many Indian scholars do you have advising
Actually,
the U.S. administration on Pakistan?
It's not the case that there are not a lot of scholars working on Pakistan. In fact, there are. The difficulty is the travel restrictions that are put on them when they come here to do work. So, for example, if you take a look at the institutional as well as the individual memberships in the American Institute of Pakistan Studies, which is the consortium of U.S. universities devoted to topics associated with Pakistan, the individual memberships have shot up incredibly in the last 10 years. As a matter of fact, we've had to add 3 or 4 new trustees for individual members only in the last 5 years. So I think 5 years ago we had 80 some, and now we have over 160 individual members. Same thing with institutional affiliations. So there was a small group of Research One universities, and now we have an increasingly large number of not only Research One universities involved, but smaller colleges also from across the United States. So there is a huge interest that is there. Part of the problem, and this is what I'm sort of pointing at, is the issue of having those individuals have access to funding. I guess if people are self-funded, which unfortunately most academics are not the rich type, then you're lucky. You can go anywhere you want.
But there's just one more quick comment that I want you to make before I move on to Zia and Asad, and that is that there was this news item that 12 think tanks and universities in the United States sent an advisory to President Trump, and they said that in the short range you should not call Pakistan a terror-sponsoring state, but in the long term that option should be on the table. And it went on to say that you should revoke its status as a non-NATO ally in 6 months and revisit the relationship, and the trade and other concessions that are given to Pakistan should be based on what Pakistan is doing on terror. So is our relationship with the United States just that, what we're doing on terror?
To be honest with you, most people who are involved in the American Institute of Pakistan Studies, U.S. academics, are not actually involved in those questions at all. They're interested in sociocultural, economic, political questions at the local level, not these sorts of geostrategic questions that seem to dominate.
Where does this advisory come from?
That I can't tell you. It doesn't come from out of the academic community and out of the academic scholars who are interested in these sorts of questions of building people-to-people relationships And I think ultimately, if you're going to have a longer-term sort of relationship, those strategic relationships need to be dependent upon those sort of longer-term people-to-people relationships that have been unfortunately, have been sort of blocked in recent years. And I just add particularly, while this did change under the last administration, and we were able to send relatively freely scholars to Islamabad and Lahore, that has not been the case for Karachi. Where there has still been a long-term sort of ban on sending scholars here. I'm hoping my presence here and is maybe a little bit of a change for that, but only time will tell.
Thank you so much, Rafi, and thank you for being here, and thank you for having the courage to visit Karachi and being a part of this
Not at
very
all.
vibrant
Not at all.
activity that is going on. Zia, over to you.
fourth
How do you see things, both globally, regionally, and yes, we're talking about Pakistan and South Asia, but I'd also want you to look at what is happening between Pakistan and the United States, and how is it impacting Pakistan-Afghanistan relations, Pakistan-India relations. Because this convergence between Washington and New Delhi, and this mantra about Pakistan being isolated.
Well, thank you. I think there are still people trying to come in, so if you want to move in a little bit,
That would be
I can
nice,
wait a
actually.
minute
Yes.
until you find.
And maybe open the door if more people want to come in.
Yes, we've got no space. We can barely hear you. There are people constantly coming in.
Okay.
Doors constantly opening, so we've barely been able to hear you half the conversation.
Let's come
That's
and
why
switch
the
up.
door. That's why the door really should be
All
open.
right. Okay, so we carry on. And thank you once again for being here.
So let me make 3 interlinked observations. The first is about where the United States is now with the election of Donald Trump and where that might go. And the second is how that may impact the region and then in Pakistan. So beginning with Trump, I think one of the things that you have to begin in understanding Donald Trump is that President Obama was fundamentally a reformer, trying to deal with the fact of the change of American power in the world. And so his goal was to help America and the world order adjust to American decline. Donald Trump is a restorationist. When he's asked, what do you mean by make America great again? When was it great? Exactly. And what does greatness look like in your mind that you are going to? And he actually has an answer. His first answer, it was 100 years ago. And he attributes that moment of greatness to a period of enormous American industrial and economic growth, of runaway capitalist entrepreneurship. The lack of any regulation, the robber baron capitalist moment in American history. So he sees that as one metric of American greatness. But when he's asked, so then when did it stop being great? It turns out that he thought America was great in the 1940s and the 1950s also. In other words, after World War II, where it is the dominant military, political, and economic power in the world order. And what he says about that is important because he says that, and I quote, this is a direct, literal quote from Donald Trump. He said, "We were a big bully." This was the moment of American greatness. He says, we were a big bully. We were a big, stupid bully. And people took advantage of us. And he talks about the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Middle East, and everybody else who took advantage of American power for their own purposes and left the Americans to pay the bill. And so with Donald Trump, the goal is to restore American power in the world, to undo the decline that he sees that has taken place since that moment of American greatness, and to do it. There's nothing wrong in his mind with being a big bully. The problem is being a big stupid bully. And Donald Trump is going to be the brains that will deal with that problem. Yes, exactly. And so the key thing about that he sees in this relationship with the United States restored to greatness and the rest of the world is about what kind of benefits flow to the United States from its hegemonic position. He thinks the Americans didn't get what they deserved for running the world, and this time they should get what they want and what is due to them.
Right.
And so let me come now to the region and to Pakistan, and then I'll stop. So when it comes to the region, he barely mentions Pakistan except when he talks about nuclear weapons. Right? That's when Pakistan, unlike China and other people, he doesn't see Pakistan in terms of trade or culture or even its relationship with India particularly. He sees it, oh, Pakistan has nuclear weapons and this is a problem. So you have to deal with that. He sees no particular business opportunities in Pakistan either, unlike India and elsewhere. So in the context in which you want to see this, India offers places to do deals, to make money. Pakistan doesn't, right? And Pakistan is part of the problem, not part of the solution in Trump's world. So you have to be prepared to deal with that. And so one also has to add to this the fact that the Republican Party in Congress is deeply skeptical of Pakistan and has been for many years now. And they are the people who have been pushing for more pressure on Pakistan, more sanctions on Pakistan, to hold Pakistan accountable. And there is an element within the military that believes that the United States would have won in Afghanistan already if it wasn't for Pakistan. Right? So this also is part of the dilemma that Pakistan is going to have to face, because the military is now asking Trump for all the things they wanted from Obama, and Obama said no. Now they're asking and they're hoping that Trump will say yes.
May I just, you've put it wonderfully, and I think you're absolutely right when you you compare Obama and Trump. But, Obama came as an anti-war president, so to say, and maximum bombing happened during Obama. And he could not actually do all that he said during his pre-election campaigns, whether it was Pakistan, India, whether it was withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, whether it was Middle East. Same is perhaps true for Trump. You see, for China, he's gone back on his statement. On Israel, he's gone back on the settlement statement. Pakistan, yesterday, his defense secretary had made a phone call to Peshawar. So yes, he said all this. Will he be able to do all this?
He doesn't know.
Okay. What is your comment on it?
Nobody knows, because the balance of power in the administration has not actually reached any kind of equilibrium yet. Half of the senior government positions are still empty. The people who were being nominated for the second in charge of the State Department, Trump personally rejected this person, even though the new Secretary of State asked for him. Right? So there is huge confusion about who is actually going to be in charge.
So it's the unknown phenomena. The fear is of the unknown.
Well, there's no reason to be afraid of the unknown. The issue is that right now, they don't know what they don't know, right?
Okay.
And they will get to it eventually. And in the meantime, what you can see are aspirations and interests. What you don't see is a balancing of consequences.
Okay. Yes.
Right? There's nobody there that is talking to them about, if you do this, then that.
What is going to happen?
Yeah, and then you have to weigh the decision. They may still make the same decision.
But you do see him restrained, don't you? In time.
This is only week 4, right? Okay. And the thing you have to remember about Trump is that Trump likes to fight, right? His first reaction often is to lash out. And so he's just trying to figure out how and his targets, whether it's American judges or whether it's this or that or the other, he will get his own back. So don't worry about that. But let me make one concluding comment, and it's based upon what Matthew Cook said a minute ago, that in terms of regional and international effects on Pakistan, we need to focus on this question that there is an increasing divergence that has opened up between the political, cultural politics, which in both Pakistan and India is still directed westwards, and the fact that the economic center of gravity is moving, at least for Pakistan. And so the question is that for all this effort about building economic corridors and trade with Pakistan, etc., how many people are actually sending their children to university in China? How many Chinese writers and scholars are turning up at the Karachi Literary Festival? Right? Absolutely. So the question is, how many people in this room have actually been to China, or can actually talk about how Chinese leaders or philosophers or political scientists or economists think about Pakistan at all? What you have is Pakistan's story of what China thinks of Pakistan. How many people actually care or know about how China thinks about Pakistan? What are the internal debates in China? about what Pakistan means to them and how they imagine this relationship going forward. Because without that engagement of Pakistanis with Chinese in a kind of deep and substantial and extended way, we're not going to have the kind of relationship that Pakistan will know what it's actually getting itself into. And so I will end with this one thing. Many of you will have read the famous letters to Uncle Sam that Manto wrote back in the 50s, when the US-Pakistan relationship was starting to emerge, and Manto explained America to Pakistan and Pakistan to the Americans, to the ones who wanted to know. The question is, it's time to start doing this for the Chinese. Right? So letters to Uncle Xi Jinping.
Okay, thank you for that, and this is really very interesting. Asad, he ended it on the perfect note. He talked about economy and the fulcrum of economic growth shifting from west to east. We're hearing about this. We're also hearing about Pakistan becoming one of the top economies in 2020. And I know you said very few Chinese or Pakistanis know about each other, but there's this Chinese general who recently made a very interesting comment. He said, Pakistan is China's Israel. Is US, what Israel is to the United States, Pakistan is to China. And I don't know what that comment means. And yes, how will all of this translate for Pakistan?
Well, thank you very much. I'll keep the last comment, your question at the end. I think the larger issue is that that over the last 20 years, the economy, national and international, has been driven by this phenomenon called globalization. And globalization really meant opening up your markets to others and increase trade and financial flows. What it did not mean was a same level of interaction across of people. So it's trade in finance and goods. And there are a number of countries, developing countries, which benefited from globalization. Globalization was always dividing countries from within, as we now see in America. There's a debate. And we are at a very interesting and important stage right now where the electorate of the United States and a large part of Europe is rejecting globalization. And China has become the flag bearer of globalization. The Chinese Prime Minister at Davos was the most positive, the biggest voice for globalization. So it's remarkable if you think how what goes around comes around in all manner of interesting ways. But if we take the starting point of globalization to be the early 90s after the end of the Cold War, I have a graph over there which just tells you how Pakistan on the economic front has fallen behind on the loop of globalization. So this is a very important indicator of globalization is exports. And these are per capita exports of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And in the early 90s, you see all three of them at about the same level. And then you see India and Bangladesh going in the northeast direction and Pakistan sort of remaining on a lower gradient. And this is actually, they say that a picture speaks for 1,000 words. Now, if you take this to be a picture, it speaks, I think, for us looking at political economy, this speaks 100,000 words. This just tells you where Pakistan, to start with, has remained in terms of the structure of its economy. Now, that was the first whammy. The second whammy was the label of terrorism and the situation of terrorism. The label had its basis also. 9/11 was its beginning, and in many ways the 2011 incident of Osama bin Laden being caught from Pakistan was its climax. Pakistan has become isolated. It's a fact. Anybody who wants to travel with a green passport would know that over the years, how progressively, virtually every year, it becomes more difficult to travel outside of Pakistan. Those of us who remember Karachi in the 1970s, I was taking one of the participants around yesterday, and I was telling him that around Metropole and that corridor, we would see so many foreigners, and now we don't see anyone.
We see a lot of Chinese, Asad, and while we
Yeah.
were being
Yeah,
isolated, have they been
we'll-
adopted by China?
Yeah,
Seriously.
we will come to that. We'll come to China. But there has been an issue of isolation. Part of the export story also is that your suppliers don't want to come here or they cannot come here. And and it's more difficult for Pakistanis to progressively more difficult to travel abroad. Now, so that's the other whammy. So it is really the double whammy.
So
that
Zarbe Azab,
we,
Karachi operation, Balochistan operation has done nothing to improve the situation.
it may have improved the situation, but that's not what the perception in the rest of the world is.
So our Zarbe Azab is just we
You know, I
blowing our
think
own
it's
trumpet.
Zarbe Azab, the world, and I think Matthew and Zia would be able to perhaps dwell better on this as to what the perception. When I go out in the world, the questions put up to me are about Hafiz Saeed, about Pathankot, about
We just put him under house
a
arrest.
number of others. Under certain
arrest.
circumstances. So that perception has not been undone, and perhaps that perception has something to do with reality also. The reality being that your regional policy has been based on some level of covert warfare, both in Kashmir and in Afghanistan.
Even now?
I don't want to be missed or go missing, so I don't want to say more on that.
You conclude, and I'll let a diplomat make a comment on that.
So I think that there is a lot of inward thinking that needs to be done also. The other important element on the economy that I'd like to just flag out is that Pakistan's economy in a structural sense has remained unchanged since the late 1960s. So the share of manufactured services has increased, agriculture has declined a little bit, but you've never been part of the progressive wave of services. So Pakistan missed the wave of call centers, software development, hardware, computer hardware. I was in Thailand in the early 2000s, and there were these factories manufacturing Intel motherboards, completely labor intensive. A row of women standing, putting dots onto whatever dots are to be put on. None of that happened in Pakistan. Now the only area in terms of trade that the Pakistani economy is really geared to, given its present structure, is trading with India, which would have brought a great amount of benefit. It wouldn't have transformed Pakistan's economy. And that's because of similarity of taste, of preference, and of the nature of goods that could be traded. In our language, we say that non-tradables become tradables.
We trade fire all the time. That's all
yeah.
we're trading between India and Pakistan.
So, and the joke in the West is that your biggest export is a suicide jacket. So, unfortunately, you know that this is a reality that one has to confront with, and that was blocked also. So there's
Asad,
too much.
I hate stopping you, but if you could conclude, and then we take
sure.
one-liners from all of us, and we open the discussion.
I suppose we'll talk about CPEC at some point, but I think it's very important that that doing away with this particular geopolitical, geostrategic paradigm that Pakistan has followed for a very long time is a necessary, not a sufficient condition for Pakistan to come into the loop of the global economy and to benefit from it.
Thank you. Very quick one-liners from all of you. And Zia, I'd ask you to go first.
I want to go back to your question about the Chinese general and whether Pakistan is China's Israel. We used to be America's Israel.
We were? Really?
Right? I mean, starting in the 1950s with the military assistance agreement and the vast amounts of economic aid and the support for the military and all the rest of it, absolutely, we played the role of a military client state in the region as part of the American Cold War strategy, in the same way that Israel did and other countries did also. The fundamental difference between the American-Israeli relationship as opposed to the American-Pakistani relationship or the Chinese-Pakistani relationship is that in Washington, Israel is heard. They actually have leverage that goes back in shaping American policy, and in some ways decisively. You saw Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, go and speak in front of Congress and defy the American president, right? And got support in the American political system. You cannot imagine Pakistan doing this. So there is no question of Pakistan having leverage over Chinese policy in the way that Israel
By
has
the way,
leverage.
this is a Chinese general who said that. But do you want to add to this? Yes?
So the point of it is that the Chinese may see Pakistan as a military client, but that's a familiar role for Pakistan to be somebody else's military client. The issue is whether Pakistan is going to continue to be part of somebody else's political and military strategy, no matter what that military strategy is and how destructive it may prove to Pakistan in the long run, just as our relationship with the United States proved to be fundamentally destructive in the long term.
Great. Najmuddin Sheikh Sahab, your comment on what just Zia said and all of them said.
But, you know, I think we've drifted so far from what we were supposed to be discussing that I'm not sure that I can make a comment that's relevant.
Just something that you
But
like to add to the discussion.
let me just say this, that I'd like to return a little bit to what we were supposed to do, as I understood it. What are the problems that the regional and international situations pose for us? I think Asad has just identified few, and I think that needs to be identified. We need to be clear that so far as the Americans are concerned, they will deal with you with a soft hand. Not the think tank is not what you talked about is not going to happen. But what is going to happen is that you will have a soft hand for a time. You have to think in terms of what you're going to do about not just the Haqqani network, but the Lashkar-e-Tayyiba. You have to address that particular question.
Is that happening?
Second, right now, we've seen steps. We hope that those steps will be carried forward. But the first thing to do is to identify what the problem is going to be. Then, are we prepared for the solution, and what are the costs associated with that solution? I think there is a cost associated on which people are working, hopefully. Second, that when we talk about the regional situation, we talk about India, we also have to recognize that today Sushma Swaraj can stand up and say, we are allowing our bilateral relations to continue. We are doing so, everything, people-to-people exchanges, etc. We are not impeding them. But comprehensive dialogue is out of the question until the terrorism question has been addressed. So these are two elements that we must recognize as existing and as, frankly, determining what policies are going to be. Third, the Chinese factor. I don't think we should talk about Pakistan being China's Israel. We should talk about the fact that the One Belt, One Road, this is the Gwadar CPEC is only one element. I mean, we seem to think that it's the only element. It's not. They have a One Belt, One Road, which extends to the maritime sector. It extends to roads to Europe. It extends to routes through Central Asia. So it is important. It's going to be of enormous economic benefit if we can make it as viable as we think it's going to be. But let us not put too much emphasis.
Put all our eggs in one basket.
No, it's, and to be very careful as to exactly what the CPEC represents, what the investment, the 46 billion or 50 billion, what does it represent? Have we looked at the terms and conditions on which investments will be made, and what form is these investments going to take? How much are you going to increase? And that's a question that Asad, I think, had raised obliquely. How much is it going to increase our export potential? How are we going to be repaying the loans that we are We have problems at home. We've talked about the fact that it's a growing economy, etc. But we have already breached the law in terms of the debt ceilings. And we continue to say that, of course, we will borrow more. But borrow more for what?
Asad, I would like you to make a comment on this debt
So
trap that Pakistan is getting into.
Let me just
And-
finish
yes.
this. Let me just finish this. So let us look at all these things rather more holistically than we've done, while recognizing that when we're talking about the regional and international situations and how they impinge on us, these two questions remain. You may say it's transactional, you may say what it is, but we must recognize that for us, the two questions are going to be: how are you going to address the question of terrorism, and how are you going to address the question of stability in Afghanistan, which, to my mind, is very, very important for us, for our own stability.
Absolutely.
We are not going to restore stability here until
Unless
Afghanistan.
there's a situation in Afghanistan. Thank you, Najmuddin Sheikh Sahab. Matthew, quick comment on all of that has been said, and then Asad will conclude it, and then we open it to you
I'll
guys.
just have a sentence or two to build on what Zia said. One of the problems I think maybe going forward is to what degree we actually can take anything that's being said literally. And in fact, we've been told not to take certain things said literally coming out of Washington.
Yeah.
So I think that applies on both sides, but this is part of an ongoing negotiation process.
A little bit louder. Can you hear me? Yes. Can you adjust the mic because people can't hear you?
Okay. I was just making the comment that we have to be a little cautious about what we take literally or not literally in terms of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, particularly given the fact that we've been told not to take certain things literally that are coming out of Washington, D.C. So this is an ongoing sort of process we'll have to sort through. And I think it's two-sided, and both in Washington as well as Islamabad, as well as other cities like Karachi.
Thank you, Matthew. Asad, last word from you, and then we open the session for Q&A.
Okay, I think CPEC is the important thing which hasn't been, Najmuddin Saab touched on it. I'd leave it to you to ask questions to me on this, but if in my estimation, it's part of this old Pakistani collective psychological affliction of looking for silver bullets or for looking for others to come and solve your own problems. CPEC is becoming another divergence on which we are not going to, so we're looking for someone to solve
To bail us out,
not
No
only bail
structural
us out, to
reforms.
put us on a different trajectory while we don't do the hard work of structural reforms that need to be done. So in that sense, it is a continuation of looking towards America for a very long time and then looking to Saudi Arabia for a very long time. And we know where that both of these relationships, these cordial brotherly relationships have led us to.
A quick comment on this debt thing, every day we hear about how much debt is being taken and how comfortable our finance minister Sardar Saab is with it.
I think we haven't reached, we were in a very bad situation pre 9/11 on the debt situation. Right now, just to give you an example, Greece's
Yes, you've
debt
also been compared to Greece,
GDP ratio is about 250%. So their debt is 250% of their GDP. Pakistan is lingering around 60% still.
So okay?
65% or so. It was close to 100% in 2001 when 9/11 happened and we got
No,
the
but
big
please,
reprieve.
Asad, what does this mean for us? Geostrategy.
I think what is going to happen is that with CPEC included and falling exports, by the way, Pakistan's exports have been declining for the last 2 years. We will be going back to the IMF in the next year or two. And China doesn't have too many votes on the IMF board, and guess who does?
Yes.
So
we all
that
understand.
reality is
Thank
is
you
there.
so much. Once a hand for my panelists. We have hands. Yes, the lady in pink.
I speak loud enough so you can
Okay.
hear me anyways.
Also introduce yourself and make your question really short.
My name is Bisma Lone. I worked in New York. I have a master's in international relations from the States. I found it very ironic when you mentioned Greece's GDP and compared it to Pakistan, considering for the last 10 years, Greece is basically has lost a generation of people who have no jobs, nothing. So here's to hoping to God that we don't ever reach that point. Because I visited it at the peak of its economic crisis, and they were literally people who hadn't had work for the last 7 years. People my age, I'm 36. Another comment was that there's a lot about Trump. But the problem, and as you know, I've taught US checks and balances for 5 years. The US president, barring a few executive orders, cannot do anything. Like his travel ban has been struck down. Now it's going to get to the Supreme Court.
Very quick. Is that so? Okay. So I think Matthew did make a comment where he said we shouldn't take it literally.
Yeah, so the problem is that so many of these comments like Trump, but he can't do anything unless the judiciary or the
Okay, so the separation of powers should be a constraint.
Separation of powers. There's just they're all equal. That's the way the US
Okay,
Constitution
thank you.
is designed.
Would you like to respond to that, or we take it as a comment?
So, I mean, I want to respond to the debt situation. There's fundamentally very different economies. Pakistan, 80% of employment is in the informal sector. So people are going to keep working for very low wages and low returns for everything. And we are already in that situation. Well, what it does over here is something very different. It creates a macro balance of payment crisis. You keep running back to the IMF, and then we talk about sovereignty. Obviously, you hand over your sovereignty once you go back to.
Yes, thank you. We can't have a cross talk. We have other people who want to ask questions.
I just wanted to know about this China. Of course, you wanted.
Sir, I hate to interrupt you, but there was this lady at the back
Sure.
that raised hand before you did, and after that, of course, you.
No problem.
Quick and short.
Yes, of course. My name is Laura Tedesco. I have a question for His Excellency. Please, you referenced General Nicholson's recent comments for a troop increase in Afghanistan. And in the context of that request, he referenced Russia's role in legitimizing the Taliban recently by saying the Taliban is fighting ISIS. And I'd like to know further your thoughts on some of those comments.
Well, there is this thought that right now the Americans, meaning Flynn and Mattis and Nicholson, the present commander in Afghanistan, worry about the inroads that ISIS is making in Afghanistan, and that there is something that can be done on that account. But on the other hand, the Americans are very concerned about the fact that the Russians are now assisting the Taliban, perhaps with an anti-ISIS objective, but which in turn is eroding the possibilities of reconciliation. So there are many complex factors at play in Afghanistan. One of the complex factors in play is the disunity within Afghanistan itself. The fact that instability in Afghanistan is preferred by people who are making money from the fact that the 45% increase in the opium production in 2016 as compared to 2015. Now this is money that is shared equally or perhaps unequally between the Taliban and Afghan officials. Now those officials don't want that particular source to disappear. The warlord that I referred to controls one of the most important drug trafficking routes to Central Asia and onwards to Russia. I don't think he wants that to disappear. So there are very many complex factors at play. So you think about Iran also maintaining contacts with the Taliban, the Russians maintaining contacts, and of course we are the bad boys theoretically in that particular respect. But I think we are beginning to get a hold on this, recognizing that for us, a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan or an Afghanistan which continues to be troubled because of the Taliban is going to fester instability, more instability in Pakistan, and that is one of the factors that we have to bring under control.
Thank you. Right after you.
I guess my question is about China, and of course, we've seen our relationship with the US, we've seen our relationship with Saudi Arabia. Now we are banking on China to bail us out. We can never get our act together. How far do you think the Chinese will support, and when would be the time when they say, okay, enough is enough, we're also pulling back? Or will they?
Mr. maybe would you like to respond to that?
This is a really important question. And one of the things that people don't have a good understanding of is that historically China has not reached out and made alliances, unlike the United States, which built a worldwide network of alliances after World War II, as did the Russians. The Chinese basically just went their own way. And so if you look, who are China's closest allies, right? It is North Korea and Pakistan. This is the company we are keeping, right? Both of them seen as profound problems for the international system, right? And the Chinese are now walking away from the North Koreans to the extent that they can. And the problem for them is that the North Koreans are sitting on their border. They cannot abandon them
I had
completely.
Najmuddin Sheikh said completely disagreeing with you. So I'll let you make a comment on your comment.
But I think the question that you're getting at is, at what stage does China decide that it's had enough? And I think this has to be determined in large part by A, will their hope of how much money they will make out of this corridor actually be realized?
That's right.
Right? And you can't keep making money infinitely at this kind of 17, 18, 20% rate of return that they're expecting on their investment without basically crushing Pakistan. Right? So that's one question. Eventually they'll just suck it all up. And then what's the interest? The second part is that they are also concerned about the domestic situation in Pakistan in terms of these issues of the jihad and these kinds of problems and how that may spill over and affect not just their investment in Pakistan, but politics in China also. And so ultimately, I think it comes down to the fact that whatever the Chinese or the Americans or anybody else has in terms of their impact on Pakistan is going to be determined by domestic Pakistani political and policy processes, who's in charge, who gets to decide what happens in Pakistan, because a deeply undemocratic, unjust, military-led Pakistan is going to be a problem no matter what happens. And that's for us to decide and not for the Chinese.
Okay.
You know, one of the things I'd like to add here is really that I think we continue to give geostrategic significance to CPEC when the Chinese very carefully talk about geoeconomic. The economic advantages to China of this route are enormous. You're cutting your travel time by 4 weeks. In the case of one set of exports, you're cutting the time and the amount required to go back with oil to China. It's all so well figured in terms of economics that the benefits are clear. Benefits are clear to both. Now the problem with us is that we are thinking of this as a game changer in geostrategic terms. It is a game changer in geoeconomic terms, but we have to negotiate the terms of the economics much more carefully. We have to be sure that these are not 18 and 22% returns. These are returns which are more in line with the returns that are available globally. And the global returns these days, Asad might correct me if he wishes, but it is between 6 to 8%. What are we going to do if we are paying 22% or 18%? So the terms on which the loans are negotiated, the joint ventures that are planned, and above all, whether these centers that you set up, these business centers that you set up, or the trading sites and the industrial sites that you set up, how much of an exportable surplus are they going to generate, which will enable you to service the loans that you're going to be taking, or that your private sector is going to be taking, because eventually that is the liability of Pakistan. Last, I just want to add one more thing. In terms of debt, please remember we have legislation. We have legislation passed by Parliament says that you will not exceed 60% of GDP. You are exceeding it. I'm only saying that in terms of debt and in terms of other matters, respect the laws that you pass.
Absolutely. This young man here, okay?
May I ask, why is Balochistan missing from the discussion? Assad already said that he doesn't want to be missing himself. But what about rest of you? I mean, it looks like if Indians were talking about everything else except Kashmir,
We are talking
what's the
about
problem,
I did say
Balochistan?
Operation, operation. But Matthew, would you like to make a comment on that?
It's hard enough
Thank
to
you.
get to Karachi, let alone Balochistan.
No, I don't think you
5
can.
minutes more.
I don't think you can avoid Balochistan. Balochistan is the heart of CPEC. I mean, there is no CPEC. There is no passageway. There is no geo-economic advantage if Balochistan continues to be disturbed. So the first thing has got to be that you provide opportunities for Balochistan to participate more fully and to be economically benefited from what you're trying to do. You're creating a security force for CPEC and for safeguarding that particular access route, but the safeguard really lies in stabilizing the situation in Balochistan. So I don't think Balochistan can ever be excluded if you're thinking in terms of the benefits that are supposed to flow from CPEC, both to China and to Pakistan.
Thank you. We just have 5 minutes, so I'm going to take 3 questions together and let the panelists respond to that, and then we conclude. So, Beta, you, and then somebody here, and no, one person.
No, I'm the one. Left side, left seat.
Yeah, I've asked just ask us. Okay. All right. Okay. Your question, and then I go to the left side.
I'm the volunteer, so I'm just passing on the mic.
Okay. We have one less question now. Your question and 2 questions here. 3 questions, and we need to conclude the session.
My name is
thank you for your interest.
Yeah, my name is Imtiaz Solangi. Mr. Najmuddin Sheikh said that benefits of CPEC for the China are enormous. But we don't see figures clearly for the Pakistan, what benefits Pakistan is going to reap from this CPEC. That's very important. Probably I would like Asad's comment on this. Number one. And secondly, there is some whispers of, we are hearing, not clearly, people are saying loudly, probably they are afraid, that this is some form of new East India Company as well. Probably you can comment on both elements, economic benefits as well as fear.
Thank you, Solangi Sahab. I need to take 2 more questions, and so that the panelists can respond. So over to the left side, you and then you.
Okay, short comment. My name is Ali Saeed, and I'm an ex-banker as well. Number one, Dr. Ishaq Husain's article, op-ed in Dawn this morning, addressing this very issue on the facts of the CPEC and Pakistan's debt servicing burden on it, something like 3.5 billion. Please have a look if you guys are interested. Number one. Number two, from my project financing days, working on the independent power projects, the returns back in 1995 offered to foreign investors, equity investors, Sheikh Sahab, were north of 15%.
Yes.
In dollar terms. Just want to make that point.
No question? It is a comment. So we can take 1 more question.
Sumro. Is this, Mr. Matthew, is CPEC is continuity of first Afghan war of 1838? What will be the reaction of Europe and America?
Matthew.
Very interesting.
Okay, thank you so much. Matthew.
There's a historical jump between 2 points, and there's a lot of history between them. I would be cautious about drawing the conclusion and drawing the if you will, relationship between those two. There is a sort of a long history about trade. And it also relates to issues, of course, about opium production in Afghanistan, because one of the reasons for the Afghan wars in the 1900s, or 19th century, of course, was to shut down opium production routes so that the East India Company, getting back to the East India Company, could in fact protect its monopoly over opium production in South Asia. So there might be connections. It's an interesting historical question to think about, and maybe to connect up to interesting geopolitical questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Asad, would you like to make a comment?
I think it's this issue of how Pakistan benefits from CPEC depends on how you want Pakistan to benefit from CPEC. Some bankers are very excited that they're going to get Pakistani entrepreneurs to finance 10% or 5% of equity, and they get to be part of it. Those Pakistani businessmen are interested because CPEC projects bypass the Public Procurement Regulatory Authority rules. They bypass NEPRA tariffs and so on and so forth. So they bypass all your regulatory structures. So it becomes a free fall for it. How does it impact the economy in a larger scale? China doesn't create too much, Chinese investment anywhere in the world doesn't create too much employment. because they bring their own labor. China is the only country which is investing elsewhere, which is both capital abundant and labor abundant. So it's different than France or Germany or the US investing in Pakistan or elsewhere. So if you're not going to get those employment linkages, and very interestingly, go on the Planning Commission website, look at CPEC, and they don't give you a figure of what the employment potential is going to be, because they themselves don't know, and it's going to be, on all projections, it's going to be very low. Plus the debt burden, and the debt burden will eventually take you back. Remember, for the last 2 years, exports have been negative, have had negative growth in Pakistan. You go back to the IMF, and China has no vote on the IMF board. So basically, yes, it's going to be a game changer, just like the PL 480 or whatever was supposed to be a game changer in the 1960s. The Arab oil wealth, the petrodollar was supposed to be a game changer, and see where it landed us. I think there's one silver lining though, which is going to which hopefully can cut out the previous bad adventures. China is an agglomeration of 1 billion people who, by and large, do not have any serious religious affiliation and are a large agglomeration of secular people. Now that might cut out the extremism of the other sort that has happened in Pakistan.
That's very far-fetched optimism, Asad.
Trying to look for positives.
Yeah, so let me make one observation that I think is important to keep in mind, and that is that we're talking basically about a vast, sustained capitalist project. And capitalism, we know from hundreds of years, is a mechanism for generating difference and inequality as well as growth, because it's not committed to an equitable distribution of the process of production, distribution, and exchange. So when you ask, how will Pakistan benefit? The answer is Pakistan will benefit depending on how you measure it. What you actually have to look at is how will it express itself at sub-regional and local levels, and in terms of whether people in the middle class in the cities will benefit, or the people who are poor in the cities will benefit, or the people in the countryside will benefit, whether the benefits will flow equally and appropriately to the Baloch as opposed to the Punjabis in terms of capital and labor and politics, and what happens to... So the question about how will Pakistan benefit, if you had asked this question in the 1960s, how is Pakistan benefiting from the economic policies of the 60s, you would have said, we're doing fine until you had 1971, right? So you can't ask this question in this abstract level of national benefit. Capitalism fundamentally doesn't work like that. You actually have to look at it at a much more disaggregated level, both in terms of class and society and geography.
Time's up.
Sorry.
Yes. Last comment from Najmuddin Sheikh.
Just to address the point that our ex-banker friend made here, I think he made a very valid point, that the returns that we've been promising were upwards. In fact, they were 18% at 60% of capacity for the IPPs. But we know what that resulted in. And that was at a time when international interest rates were much higher. We are now talking about interest rates which hover between 1% and 3%. So why should we be paying 18% returns now? That is one point. The other point is that we must know precisely what CPEC is going to do in terms of the industrial estates that are created for enlarging the export potential, which will enable us to repay what we are borrowing.
Thank you, Najmuddin Sheikh.
Thank you.
So we are asking for something which Pakistan is not very good at, and that is transparency. Thank you so much. Thank you all of you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're done.